every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The humid air of central Florida often hangs heavy, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, a silent witness to the endless procession of 18-wheelers rumbling down Interstate 75 and its arterial state roads. For decades, these highways have been the lifeblood of commerce, but also a shadowy realm where anonymity thrives, and vulnerability can be exploited. Truck stops, dimly lit bars, and secluded rest areas become transient havens, or, for some, the final, unsuspecting destination. It was in this liminal space, where lives intersected briefly and often without consequence, that a chilling new chapter in American true crime began to unfold. One that would challenge deeply ingrained societal assumptions about violence, victimhood, and the very nature of evil. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, a series of disappearances and gruesome discoveries began to plague the Sunshine State. Men, mostly middle-aged, some truckers, some businessmen, vanished without a trace, only to be found later, often in remote wooded areas, their bodies bearing the unmistakable marks of a violent end, their vehicles, their wallets, their very identities, stripped away. The initial investigations were fragmented, disparate cases handled by different jurisdictions, each a tragic, isolated incident. But as the body count mounted, a terrifying pattern emerged, a thread woven through the fabric of these seemingly unrelated deaths: a .22 caliber bullet, a stolen car, and the chilling realization that a serial killer was operating with a brutal efficiency rarely seen, especially not from the figure who would eventually be unmasked. Today, on Anatomy of Crime, we delve into the complex and disturbing psychology of Aileen Wuornos, a woman whose life was a brutal tapestry of abuse and desperation, and whose actions forced us to confront the uncomfortable question: was she a victim who lashed out, or a cold-blooded predator? We will dissect the anatomy of her traumatic genesis, tracing the lineage of her violence from a childhood steeped in neglect and sexual abuse, through a life on the margins, to the desolate highways where she became known as the Damsel of Death. Her story is not just a chronicle of murder, but a profound exploration of how profound trauma can warp a human psyche, and how the lines between victim and perpetrator can become tragically blurred. Aileen Carol Pittman was born on February 29, 1956 in Rochester, Michigan, a leap year baby whose life would be anything but ordinary. Her beginnings were marked by an immediate and profound absence of stability. Her father, Leo Dale Pittman, was a diagnosed schizophrenic and a convicted child molester who was incarcerated before Aileen's birth, and later committed suicide in prison. This paternal legacy, a shadow of mental illness and sexual deviancy, cast a long, dark pall over Aileen's very origins, a genetic and environmental predisposition to instability that she would never escape. Her mother, Diane Wuornos, a young woman herself, abandoned Aileen and her older brother, Keith, when Aileen was just 4 years old. This early, foundational trauma of abandonment set the stage for a life defined by instability and a desperate search for connection that would forever elude her. The psychological impact of such early maternal rejection is immeasurable, often leading to deep-seated attachment issues. Aileen and Keith were sent to live with their maternal grandparents, Lori and Britta Wuornos, in Troy, Michigan. While on the surface this might have appeared to be a chance at a stable upbringing, the reality was far more sinister. Lori Wuornos was an alcoholic and, by Aileen's later accounts, physically and sexually abusive. He was a man prone to violent outbursts, and his home was far from a sanctuary. Britta, her grandmother, was described as emotionally distant and often complicit in Laurie's abuse, or at the very least, unwilling or unable to protect her grandchildren. Aileen's childhood was not merely difficult. It was a relentless gauntlet of neglect, violence, and sexual exploitation. She reported being sexually abused by her grandfather and his friends from a very young age, a trauma that would fester and shape her perception of men and relationships for the rest of her life. The repeated violation of her body and trust by the very figures who were meant to protect her instilled a profound sense of betrayal, a deep-seated rage, and a complete erosion of her ability. This early, pervasive sexual abuse is a critical component in understanding the later trajectory of her life and her violent acts against men. It created a psychological framework where men were inherently dangerous, exploitative, and to be feared, yet also a source of a twisted form of attention or survival. By the age of 11, Aileen was engaging in sexual activity, a desperate attempt, perhaps, to find some form of attention or control in a world that offered her neither. This was not consensual exploration, but a continuation of her exploitation, often trading sex for basic necessities like food, cigarettes, or small amounts of money, a pattern that would tragically define her adult life. Her academic performance suffered dramatically. She struggled with learning disabilities, and her behavior became increasingly erratic, marked by defiance, truancy, and outbursts of anger. She was eventually expelled from school, severing one of the last remaining ties to a semblance of normalcy. At 14, she became pregnant by a friend of her brother's. She gave birth to a son, whom she immediately gave up for adoption, another profound loss in a life already overflowing with them. This experience, the forced relinquishment of her child, added another layer of grief, shame, and detachment to her already fractured psyche, reinforcing her belief that she was unworthy of love. Her teenage years spiraled further into chaos. She was often homeless, drifting between friends' couches and the streets, engaging in petty crime and increasingly relying on prostitution for survival. Her first arrest came at 15 for disorderly conduct. This was followed by a string of arrests for various offenses, including assault, grand theft auto, and passing bad checks. Each arrest, each stint in juvenile detention or jail, reinforced her sense of being an outcast, a pariah, further solidifying her distrust of authority and society at large. She was a young woman adrift, without an anchor, without guidance, and without the fundamental emotional tools to navigate a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty. Her experiences with the legal system from a young age likely cemented a perception of it as an oppressive force rather than a source of justice or protection. In 1976, at the age of 20, Aileen married Louis Gratz Fell, a wealthy 69-year-old yacht club president. This brief, tumultuous marriage lasted only 9 weeks and ended with Aileen assaulting Fell with his own cane. It was a desperate, ill-fated attempt at stability, a fleeting moment where she tried to escape her past, but her deeply ingrained patterns of behavior and her inability to form healthy attachments sabotaged any chance of a normal life. The marriage, rather than providing security, quickly devolved into conflict, highlighting her inability to maintain stable relationships and her propensity for violence when feeling threatened or cornered. After the divorce, she continued her transient existence, moving from state to state, always returning to the life of a highway prostitute. a life that offered a perverse sense of control and independence, even as it subjected her to constant danger and degradation. This lifestyle, while offering a means of survival, also placed her in a perpetual state of vulnerability, constantly exposed to violent men. By the late 1980s, Aileen Wuornos had settled, if one could call it that, in Florida. She was living with Tyria Moore, a woman she had met in a Daytona Beach bar in 1986. Their relationship was intense, volatile, and deeply codependent. Tyria provided Aileen with a semblance of stability and affection, something Aileen had craved her entire life. For Aileen, Tyria represented a lifeline, a source of unconditional love and acceptance that she had never experienced. This emotional dependency was profound, and Aileen felt an immense pressure to provide for Tyria, to protect their fragile bond. However, Aileen's financial struggles were constant, and she continued to work as a prostitute along the desolate stretches of I-75 and other major roads, often picking up truckers and other transient men. It was during this period, a time of increasing desperation and a perceived need to provide for Tyria, that Aileen Wuornos crossed the line from victim of circumstance to perpetrator of unspeakable violence. The confluence of her deep-seated trauma, her precarious financial situation, and her intense emotional attachment to Tyria created a volatile psychological cocktail that would soon erupt. The first murder attributed to Aileen Wuornos occurred in November 1989. The victim was Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old electronics store owner from Clearwater, Florida. Wuornos later claimed that Mallory had picked her up, driven her to a secluded area, and then brutally raped her. In her account, she fought back, grabbed his .22 caliber pistol, and shot him multiple times in self-defense. Mallory's body was discovered in a wooded area near Ormond Beach on December 13, 1989, nearly a month after his disappearance. He had been shot multiple times in the torso. His car, a 1988 Pontiac Grand Prix, was found abandoned in Daytona Beach. This initial incident, whether an act of self-preservation or a calculated robbery, marked the beginning of a terrifying spree. The police investigation into Mallory's death was initially hampered by the lack of witnesses and the remote location of the body. There was no immediate connection to other cases, and the possibility of a serial killer was not yet on anyone's radar. The pattern, once established, escalated rapidly. Just 5 months later, in May 1990, David Spears, a 43-year-old construction worker, was found dead in a wooded area in Citrus County. He had been shot 6 times with a .22 caliber weapon. His car, a 1985 Pontiac Trans Am, was later found abandoned. The similarities were striking, but still the cases were not immediately linked across county lines. The sheer number of shots fired at Spears, 6 in total, raised questions about the nature of self-defense, suggesting an overkill that went beyond merely stopping an attacker. In June 1990, Charles Karskaden, a 40-year-old rodeo worker, became the third victim. His body, also shot multiple times with a .22, was discovered in Pasco County. His car, a 1982 Ford F-150 pickup, was found abandoned in Marion County. The geographical spread of the bodies and abandoned vehicles made it difficult for investigators to connect the dots. As each discovery fell under a different jurisdiction, each county was investigating what appeared to be an isolated homicide, unaware of the larger, terrifying pattern emerging across the state. The lack of a centralized database or immediate communication between these disparate law enforcement agencies allowed the killer to operate with relative impunity for a time. The fourth victim, Peter Seams, a 65-year-old merchant seaman, disappeared in July 1990. His body was never found, a detail that would later become a point of contention in the legal proceedings. However, his car, a 1986 Cadillac, was found abandoned in Orange County. Crucially, two women, later identified as Aileen Wuornos and Tyria Moore, were seen driving Seams' car after his disappearance. This sighting, though initially just a lead, would prove vital. The fact that Seams' body was never recovered made it challenging for the prosecution to definitively prove the circumstances of his death, relying heavily on circumstantial evidence and later Wuornos' own confessions. Troy Burris, a 50-year-old sausage salesman, was found dead in August 1990 in Marion County, shot twice in the chest. His car, a 1980 Toyota pickup, was found abandoned in Volusia County. The relentless pace of the killings, coupled with the consistent method and weapon, began to paint a clearer, more terrifying picture for law enforcement. The discovery of Burris's body, relatively quickly after his disappearance, added to the growing sense of urgency among investigators. In September 1990, Charles Dick Humphreys, a 56-year-old former police chief, was found dead in Marion County, shot 7 times. His car, a 1986 Ford Limited, was found abandoned in Brevard County. The irony of a former law enforcement officer falling victim to this unseen killer was not lost on investigators. The sheer number of shots fired at Humphreys, 7, again suggested an extreme level of violence, far beyond what might be considered necessary for self-defense. This particular murder, involving a former police chief, likely intensified the pressure on law enforcement to apprehend the killer. The final victim, Walter Antonio, a 62-year-old missionary and truck driver, was found dead in November 1990 in Dixie County, shot 4 times. His car, a 1988 Pontiac Grand Am, was found abandoned in Brevard County. 7 men, all shot with a .22 caliber weapon, all robbed, their vehicles stolen and later discarded. The sheer audacity and frequency of the crimes, committed by a killer who left little forensic evidence at the scene of the bodies, created a climate of fear and frustration among law enforcement. The victims were diverse in age and profession, but all were men, often traveling alone, making them vulnerable targets along the highways. The consistent use of a .22 caliber weapon, a relatively small caliber, yet deadly at close range, became the signature of the killer. The breakthrough in the investigation came not from a single crime scene, but from the meticulous work of linking seemingly unrelated incidents. Detectives from various counties, including Volusia, Marion, and Citrus, began to communicate and share information. This interagency cooperation was crucial. The common thread of the .22 caliber weapon was established through ballistics analysis, confirming that the same gun was used in multiple murders. This was the first crucial step in identifying a serial killer, moving the investigations from isolated homicides to a coordinated hunt for a single perpetrator. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement, FDLE, played a vital role in centralizing the information and connecting the various cases. The abandoned vehicles also provided vital clues. Investigators discovered that many of the victims' belongings had been pawned. Aileen Wuornos and Tyria Moore had pawned several items, including a camera and a radar detector. that were later identified as belonging to the victims. This was a critical error on Wuornos's part, as pawnshop records required identification, providing law enforcement with their first solid lead to a suspect. The paper trail left by the pawned items, specifically the fingerprints and signatures on the pawn slips, directly linked Wuornos to the victim's possessions. This tangible evidence was far more compelling than eyewitness accounts alone. The composite sketch, based on the sighting of two women driving Peter Seam's Cadillac, also played a significant role. Witnesses described a woman with a distinctive appearance, which matched Aileen Wuornos. The sketch was widely circulated, and tips began to pour in. One crucial tip came from a woman who recognized Wuornos from the sketch and knew her to be a prostitute who frequented certain bars and truck stops. This tip helped narrow the search considerably. The net began to tighten around Wuornos and Moore. On January 9, 1991, Tyria Moore was located at a relative's home in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and taken into custody. She was questioned extensively by investigators, who offered her immunity in exchange for her cooperation. Moore, terrified and overwhelmed, eventually agreed to help. Her testimony would become a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Tyria Moore's decision to cooperate was a pivotal moment. Her intimate knowledge of Wuornos's activities, her presence during the disposal of some of the stolen vehicles, and her direct confessions from Wuornos herself provided the prosecution with an insider's account that was incredibly damaging to the defense. She described how Aileen would come back from encounters with men, sometimes agitated, sometimes calm, and how she would often have new items or a new car. Moore's cooperation led police directly to Aileen Wuornos. On January 16, 1991, Wuornos was arrested at the Last Resort, a biker bar in Port Orange, Florida. She was initially taken into custody on an outstanding warrant for carrying a concealed weapon. Once in custody, the full weight of the murder investigations descended upon her. Detectives from multiple jurisdictions converged, eager to question the woman they now believed was responsible for the string of highway murders. During her initial interrogations, Aileen Wuornos was remarkably candid, even boastful, about the killings. She confessed to all 7 murders, providing details that only the killer would know. She described the encounters, the shootings, and the disposal of the bodies. However, her narrative was not without its complexities. While admitting to the acts, she vehemently maintained that each killing was an act of self-defense. She claimed that every man she killed had either raped her or attempted to rape her, and that she had fought back to save her own life. She painted a picture of herself as a victim, constantly under threat, forced to resort to extreme violence to survive the predatory nature of her clients. Her confessions were often volatile, contradictory, and emotionally charged. At times, she appeared remorseful, expressing regret for the lives she had taken. She would cry, express fear, and speak of wanting to be a good person. At other times, she was defiant, portraying herself as a victim of circumstance, a woman pushed to the brink by a lifetime of abuse and the inherent dangers of her profession. She would lash out at the detectives, accusing them of not understanding her plight, of siding with the scumbags she claimed to have killed. This shifting narrative, this oscillation between victim and aggressor, would become the central psychological battleground of her legal defense. The detectives, particularly Detective Richard Gunther, spent hours with Wuornos, meticulously documenting her statements, trying to discern truth from fabrication, and attempting to understand the motivations behind her brutal acts. They noted her rapid mood swings, her tendency to embellish, and her deep-seated anger. The prosecution, led by State Attorney John Tanner, viewed Wuornos as a cold-blooded killer motivated by robbery. They argued that her claims of self-defense were fabricated, a desperate attempt to avoid responsibility for premeditated murder. They pointed to the fact that in many cases, the victims had been shot multiple times, often in the back, and that their belongings had been systematically stolen. The lack of consistent physical evidence of rape at all crime scenes also undermined her claims in the eyes of the prosecution. While Wuornos claimed rape, forensic examinations of the bodies often yielded no evidence of sexual assault, or the evidence was inconclusive due to decomposition or the nature of the crime scene. The prosecution emphasized the financial gain, arguing that the stolen cars and pawned items were the primary motive, and that the self-defense claims were a convenient cover story. Wuornos's defense team, public defenders T. Peter Collins and Brian Donnerly, faced an uphill battle. Their strategy was to portray Aileen as a victim of a deeply traumatic life, a woman suffering from severe mental illness, specifically borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder, exacerbated by a lifetime of abuse. They argued that her actions, while extreme, were a direct consequence of her psychological damage and the constant threat she faced as a prostitute. They sought to establish that she genuinely believed she was acting in self-defense, even if the objective evidence did not always support it. They aimed to humanize her, to present her not as a monster, but as a deeply disturbed individual whose capacity for rational thought and judgment had been irrevocably damaged by her past. The first trial for the murder of Richard Mallory began in January 1992. It was a highly publicized event, drawing national and international media attention. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal experts, and curious onlookers. The prosecution presented a compelling case, relying heavily on ballistics evidence, which definitively linked the .22 caliber weapon to Mallory's death and several other murders. The pawnshop records with Wuornos's fingerprints and signatures directly connected her to Mallory's stolen camera, and most crucially, the testimony of Tyria Moore. Moore, under immunity, testified against Wuornos, detailing how Wuornos had confessed to her about the killings and how they had driven the victims' stolen cars together. Moore's testimony was devastating to the defense, as it painted a picture of a calculated criminal enterprise rather than a series of desperate acts of self-preservation. She recounted how Wuornos would describe the killings, sometimes with a chilling detachment, other times with a sense of right. The defense attempted to discredit Moore, arguing that she was a co-conspirator who had struck a deal to save herself from prosecution. They highlighted her own involvement in disposing of stolen property and her initial reluctance to cooperate. They also presented expert testimony regarding Wuornos's mental state, highlighting her history of abuse and her psychological disorders. Dr. Michael Marr, a forensic psychologist, testified about Wuornos's borderline personality disorder and the profound impact of her childhood trauma. He argued that her perception of threat was severely distorted, leading her to genuinely believe she was in mortal danger, even when objective evidence might suggest otherwise. However, the jury was ultimately swayed by the prosecution's evidence of premeditation and robbery, particularly the systematic nature of the thefts and the multiple gunshot wounds inflicted on the victims. On January 27, 1992, Aileen Wuornos was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Richard Mallory. The verdict sent a clear message. Despite her traumatic past, the jury believed her actions were not solely self-defense, but deliberate acts of murder. Following the Mallory conviction, Wuornos's legal journey continued with a series of trials and plea bargains for the remaining murders. She eventually pleaded no contest or guilty to 5 other murders, receiving additional death sentences. The case of Peter Seams, whose body was never found, remained a point of contention, but the overwhelming evidence linking her to the other crimes solidified her fate. Her legal team continued to pursue appeals, arguing issues of mental competency, prosecutorial misconduct, and the validity of her confessions. However, these appeals were largely unsuccessful. The legal system, while acknowledging her difficult past, ultimately held her accountable for the murders. The media's portrayal of Aileen Wuornos was sensational and often contradictory. She was dubbed the Damsel of Death, the Monster, and America's first female serial killer, a title that, while not entirely accurate historically, captured the public's fascination and horror. Her case challenged the prevailing stereotypes of serial killers, who were predominantly male, and forced a re-evaluation of how society understood female violence. The narrative often swung between depicting her as a depraved killer and a tragic figure, a victim of a brutal system who finally snapped. Tabloid headlines screamed about the lesbian serial killer, adding another layer of sensationalism and prejudice to the coverage. Documentaries and films, most notably Monster, starring Charlize Theron, attempted to explore her story, often focusing on the tragic elements of her life and her relationship with Tyria Moore. This media frenzy, while bringing the case to national attention, also contributed to a simplified, often caricatured understanding of a deeply complex individual. From a psychological perspective, Aileen Wuornos presents a complex and deeply troubling case study. Her early life trauma is undeniable and profound. Abandonment, severe physical and sexual abuse, and a life of poverty and prostitution are all significant risk factors for developing severe psychological disorders and engaging in violent behavior. Psychologists and psychiatrists who evaluated her often diagnosed her with borderline personality disorder, BPD, and antisocial personality disorder, ASPD. Borderline personality disorder is characterized by unstable moods, relationships, self-image, and behavior. Individuals with BPD often experience intense fear of abandonment, engage in impulsive and risky behaviors, and have difficulty regulating their emotions. Wuornos's volatile relationships, her desperate need for connection, her impulsive acts of violence, and her shifting self-perception from victim to avenger are all consistent with BPD. The profound emotional dysregulation associated with BPD could have contributed to her inability to cope with perceived threats, leading to extreme reactions. Her intense fear of abandonment, particularly concerning Tyria Moore, could have fueled a desperate need for money, pushing her further into dangerous situations and potentially escalating her violence. The chronic feelings of emptiness and identity disturbance common in BPD could also explain her chameleon-like ability to adapt to different situations and her often contradictory self-descriptions. Antisocial personality disorder, on the other hand, is characterized by a pervasive pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of others. Individuals with ASPD often lack empathy, are manipulative, deceitful, and show a callous indifference to the suffering of others. While Wuornos's claims of self-defense complicate a straightforward ASPD diagnosis, her systematic robbery of victims, her initial lack of remorse in some confessions, and her ability to repeatedly engage in violent acts could be seen through this lens. The prosecution certainly emphasized these aspects, portraying her as a calculating criminal who exploited her victims for financial gain. The lack of empathy, a hallmark of ASPD, could explain her ability to repeatedly kill without apparent emotional distress in some instances, or her capacity to rationalize her actions as justified. The central debate, therefore, revolved around the interplay of these disorders and her life experiences. Was her violence a direct, albeit extreme, response to a lifetime of victimization and the immediate threat she perceived in her encounters with men, or did her underlying personality disorders, exacerbated by trauma, lead her to become a predatory individual who used the guise of self-defense to justify robbery and murder? This is the core of the anatomy of her psychology. Proponents of the victim who lashed out theory point to the inherent dangers of prostitution, particularly highway prostitution. They argue that Wuornos, having been abused her entire life, was hypervigilant to threats, and that her perception of danger was heightened. In this view, the first killing of Richard Mallory could genuinely have been an act of self-defense against a violent client. The subsequent killings, while perhaps not all direct acts of self-defense, could be seen as a continuation of a pattern, a desperate attempt to protect herself and Tyria, fueled by a distorted sense of justice and a profound distrust of men. Her psychological state, they argue, made her incapable of responding rationally to perceived threats, leading to an overreaction that turned deadly. This perspective suggests that her violence was reactive, a survival mechanism gone awry, rather than purely proactive or predatory. The concept of battered woman syndrome was sometimes invoked, though not formally applied in her defense, to explain how prolonged abuse can lead to a distorted perception of threat and a propensity for extreme self-defense. Conversely, those who viewed her as a cold-blooded predator emphasized the robbery motive. They highlighted the fact that she stole the victims' cars and belongings, often pawning them for cash. They argued that while her past was tragic, it did not excuse her actions. The prosecution maintained that her claims of self-defense were a convenient fabrication, a way to rationalize her crimes. They pointed to the fact that some victims were shot multiple times, often in the back, suggesting an intent to kill rather than merely incapacitate. The systematic nature of the killings, the disposal of bodies, and the efforts to cover her tracks all suggested a degree of premeditation and calculation. From this viewpoint, her trauma, while acknowledged, did not absolve her of moral or legal responsibility for her actions. Her ability to plan, execute, and then profit from the murders pointed towards a more calculated, antisocial personality. It is also important to consider the unique aspects of female serial killers. Historically, female serial killers are rare, comprising a small percentage of all serial murderers. When they do commit multiple murders, their methods often differ from their male counterparts. They tend to use less overt violence, often employing poison or suffocation, and their victims are frequently known to them, such as family members, patients, or romantic partners. Aileen Wuornos defied many of these stereotypes. She used firearms, a typically male-associated weapon, and targeted strangers, primarily men, in a manner more akin to male serial killers. This deviation from the norm further complicated the psychological profiling of her case. Her method of stranger-on-stranger violence, particularly with a firearm, made her an anomaly, challenging established criminological profiles. This made her even more terrifying to the public, as she did not fit the familiar, albeit disturbing, patterns of female criminality. The media's fascination with Wuornos also played a role in shaping public perception. The narrative often focused on her appearance, her rough demeanor, and her unconventional lifestyle, sometimes overshadowing the deeper psychological and sociological factors at play. The monster label was easy to apply, but it failed to capture the full complexity of a woman whose life was a testament to the devastating impact of intergenerational trauma and systemic neglect. The sensationalism often stripped away the nuance, reducing her to a two-dimensional villain rather than a product of profound societal and personal failures. As the years passed on death row, Aileen Wuornos's mental state appeared to deteriorate further. Her appeals were exhausted, and her execution date loomed. In the final years, she expressed a desire to die, stating that she wanted to be with God, and that she was tired of the legal process. She recanted some of her self-defense claims, then reaffirmed them, her narrative remaining as fluid and contradictory as ever. Her behavior became increasingly erratic, marked by outbursts, delusions, and a growing sense of paranoia. Some mental health professionals argued that she was not competent to be executed, citing her apparent delusions and erratic behavior. Dr. Harry Kropp, a psychologist who evaluated her, testified that she suffered from a severe psychotic disorder and was not rational enough to understand her impending execution. He described her as believing that the prison system was torturing her with vibrations, and that the media was conspiring against her. However, the courts ultimately ruled that she understood her situation and the nature of her punishment, a decision that sparked considerable debate among legal and mental health communities regarding the ethical implications of executing a mentally ill individual. On October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection in Florida. Her final words were, "Yes, I would just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back, like Independence Day, with Jesus, June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all, I'll be back." These words, cryptic and unsettling, were a final poignant reflection of her fractured reality, a last glimpse into the mind of a woman whose life was a battleground of trauma and violence. They offered no clear resolution, no definitive statement of remorse or defiance, but rather a final enigmatic utterance from a woman whose inner world remained largely impenetrable. The case of Aileen Wuornos remains a chilling and deeply unsettling chapter in the annals of true crime. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the origins of violence, the long-lasting scars of abuse, and the complexities of human motivation. Her story is not simply a tale of a serial killer, but a profound exploration of the anatomy of a psyche forged in the crucible of extreme trauma. The systematic dissection of her life reveals a tragic progression, from an infant abandoned, to a child brutally abused, to a teenager adrift, and finally, to an adult who became a killer. Each stage of her life was marked by a profound lack of safety, love, and stability, creating a fertile ground for the development of severe psychological disorders. The contentious debate surrounding her motives, whether she was a victim who lashed out or a cold-blooded predator, underscores the difficulty in categorizing human behavior, especially when it involves such extreme violence. The evidence suggests a complex interplay of both. Her initial acts may have indeed stemmed from a genuine, albeit distorted, perception of self-defense, a desperate reaction to a lifetime of male aggression. However, the subsequent killings, coupled with the consistent pattern of robbery, suggest a shift, or perhaps an underlying predatory impulse that emerged from her damaged psyche. The line between reactive violence and proactive aggression became blurred, perhaps even indistinguishable, within her own mind. Her case serves as a stark reminder of the devastating impact of childhood trauma and the failures of societal systems to protect vulnerable individuals. Aileen Wuornos was, in many ways, a product of the violence she experienced, a cycle of abuse that ultimately culminated in her own violent acts. Her story challenges us to look beyond the sensational headlines and to consider the intricate, often painful anatomy of a life that led to such a tragic and brutal end. The enduring question is not just what she did, but how a human being could become so utterly broken, so profoundly lost, that murder became her desperate, final act of perceived control in a world that had always controlled her. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.